Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and today we're going to be jumping into the second installment in Mastering Macro. If you haven't seen the first episode, I highly recommend you go back and watch that first. I'll link it up in the corner, as we're going to be elaborating a little bit on top of that and evolving the understanding step by step as we go. In that episode, we looked at Riot's agent classification system and broke it down a little bit more granularly so that we could understand how team compositions may look at their utility suites and how those utility suites may define their playstyle. In this one, we'll take that a step further. Instead of just looking at the utility itself, we'll look at the functional roles that agents play within compositions and how those functional roles can be mixed and matched to change out agents, allow you to eke out a little bit of a gimmick or incremental advantage against your opponents due to surprise factor, and just give a more holistic view about what those agents want to do inside of a composition and not just what they want to bring to the table. With that all said, let's jump right into it. As a preface before we jump into this, functional roles, even more so than the classification system we looked at in episode 1, is astronomically subjective. This system, as well as this whole series, is frankly wholly my personal opinion. You will find plenty of people who will vehemently disagree with this, and in some of those cases be using the exact same terms I'm about to use with grossly different definitions. That doesn't mean that any one of us is overtly right or wrong, but again, this is a subjective topic where it is entirely my opinion and my take on this area of the game. With that said and out of the way though, I want to jump into the first of the functional roles that I use to label agents in Valorant, and that is the anchor. Anchor is a term that's used in TAC FPSs all around, but being someone who didn't come with an extensive CSGO background, I have created my own definition for anchor, and well, here it is. Anchors are generally going to be characterized by two major attributes. The first of which is an ability to solo stall, whether that be on the defense side as someone who can stymie a fast execute, or on the attack side as someone who can stall fast rotates, and the second is going to be a comfortability being a late rotate. Two agents that highlight this role are Cypher. This will surprise absolutely nobody. He's one of the most staple anchors in the game due to Tripwire's ability to help stall out sites, and Spycam's ability to not only find preliminary information, but offer a retake option, making him a further valuable anchor. And also Sage, who is probably the most effective staller in the entirety of the game, but also touches more specifically on that second line of anchor attribute, where when Sage late rotates, she's still incredibly powerful, bringing that heal, bringing resurrection. When she rotates late in the game, she's almost at her best. Next on the list, we have catalysts. This is going to be a functional synonym to initiators in Riot's system, and many people refer to these as enablers coming from other games. Their primary role is to open the door, so to say, for the dive and entry players on a team. Categorically, catalysts are the role that is most likely to be tacked on as a secondary type to other elements in the team. This is because catalytic tools are such a crux of any team's dynamic that having a surplus of them will never really hurt. However, insulating yourself against inopportune early picks that would otherwise leave you without catalytic tools is astronomically high value. The most obvious catalysts in the game are Breach and Sky. Their kit with their massive stack of flashes screams catalyst. However, there's also the less apparent ones that fall more into that tack-on category I mentioned in Omen and Reyna, where they have an element in their kit that is very clearly effective as a catalytic tool, but it's not the sole reason that you're picking them. Moving on to the next category, we have Dive, one of those two that catalysts are meant to enable. A dive player's role, very similar to that of an entry, is to create space for their team. The thing that distinguishes them as a dive character as opposed to an entry is how they go about doing that. A dive character will extend themselves beyond the natural sphere of influence a team has and then pull that sphere of influence forward. They explode past the space they want to take and then backfill it behind them. The most immediately apparent dive agents are going to be Jet and Raze, although there are a couple others that can technically fill the role. We now have Yoru, who can backline gate crash, and that is a form of dive in most circumstances. We also have Omen with his double smoke, double shrouded step gimmick, as well as backline from the shadows, and those are both abstract forms of dive as well. Moving past dive, we have entry, which if you look at dive and we say that that is someone who is going to extend beyond their sphere of influence and pull it forward, an entry's job is to push the circle from within its natural bounds. They will extend to the edge of their team's sphere of influence, their zone of control, and then shove it forward, expanding it as they go. Another important attribute that comes with entries is that, unlike dive, who will typically be again, exploding through space and then working backwards, oftentimes relying on their teammates to backfill the space, entries will almost always be going in with their rifle out, and they will be the spear point that creates that space. The two most front of mind entries, for me at least, are going to be Phoenix and Yoru. Phoenix, the most prototypic one, is incredibly obvious, but Yoru a little bit less so. A lot of people would put Reyna here. I generally credit Yoru's flash as being fairly easy to self-capitalize on relatively to Reyna's, and so I put him a little bit higher into this role silo, but again, this is very much so an opinion thing. Flex's roles are gap fillers and contingency plans in most teams. They put the flex in flexibility and are brought into most compositions, not only because they can switch between roles, but because they will have to. They're the ones that teams will look for to shift entirely across silos based on round-to-round dynamics. The head and shoulders most common flex in the game right now is Sova, although we're seeing slightly more Sky utilized in this slot. While all of these so far have some degree of argument that they're a style and not a role, Lurk is very much so the one that this is most poignant in. For most, if not all of these, you could say that, well, any agent could fill that role, and generally speaking, you're absolutely correct. The reason I frame it this way isn't because the agents that fill these roles are specifically bottlenecked into them, but because there are very clear agent attributes that tailor them better to these roles than other roles. It's a matter of optimization, not mandate. And so to elaborate on lurks, the way that I've perceived lurks and the way that I talk about them in Valorant is that these are the ones who are left to hold space after it is taken by their team, and then ultimately either expand that space via timings and become a flanker, or utilize that positioning to cut off rotations. Agents that are particularly well suited to this are Cypher and Omen, Cypher being one of the most prominent that we see at the professional level, with players like Aprodo and Pora really making names for themselves as high-impact Cypher lurks, playing off of their utility to take space, finding timings and deep flanks, especially on maps like Bind. And then we have Omen, who, while he's not used as frequently as an explicit lurk as Cypher, is just as well equipped to be one. Imagine a situation where your Omen is playing with the primary pack of your team, but then he gets off his paranoia and he allows that to get his team space. At that point, if you look at Omen's kit, there's nothing left that really screams, I need to be with my team at this point. His smokes have such a long range that he can get value out of them for his teammates from functionally anywhere on the map, so leaving him into a pocket to remain as a lurk is very well suited to the way that his kit is designed. There isn't a locational condition to the primary value that his kit provides at that point. Moving to the second to last on the list, we have another one that is very ambiguous and in no way tied to specific agents, and that's operators. It's not like certain agents are barred from buying the operator, but there are certainly agents who have characteristics that enable them to use it at a higher level than others. The defining characteristics of an agent that I would assign the operator role are twofold. The first prerequisite is a movement or verticality ability that gives the operator user access to a more broad range of angles. And the second is a fallback facilitator, whether that be by way of LOS obstruction or positional displacement via something like pop damage, or another explosive movement ability, as everyone knows with Jet. The two most obvious ones here are going to be Jet and Raze, although there's certainly cases to be made for quite a few others, my personal favorites being Omen and Sage. And that will bring us to the last one, which is a bit of a standout. It is quite literally a single piece of utility, which is smokes. This further stands out because there is no line for flashes. Smokes, in terms of their value in redrawing battle lines, are a near mandatory tool in most strategists' kits. And while flashes are very well captured in the entry role and the catalyst role, there really is nothing that overtly has to include smokes, thus the need for it to have its own line here. And I don't think anyone needs me to tell them who has smokes in this game, as it is glaringly obvious, so we'll move right along. Now that we've set a baseline for what the functional roles are in this game, we can take a look at the archetypal compositions that are common in regions around the world, fit them into those categories, and then start mix and matching agents that can also fit those silos, allowing us to permutate and expand on these compositions to introduce more variety, find gimmicks, and eke out advantage wherever possible. If we first take a look at North American Standard, you have commonly a Sovo who fills a flex role, an Omen who fills a smokes and catalyst role, a Cypher who plays a lurk and anchor role, a Jet who plays a dive and op role, and a Phoenix who fills an entry and catalyst role. A fairly well-rounded comp, and there's very clear segmentation of the functional roles across the board. Moving over to more of a Southeast Asian standard composition, we can see that having an identical set of functional roles across all compositions is far from necessary. In this case, they trade out the Phoenix, who filled an entry and catalyst role, for a Raze who fills an entirely dive role most of the time, with a very soft leaning into op when absolutely necessary. While this sacrifices the catalytic redundancy that we see in North America's composition, what it gains is an incredibly aggressive skew towards pulling forward their team's map control. If we move over to EU standard, it's the exact opposite, where they're not sacrificing catalytic tools, they're building upon them further. They create a glut of that particular type of utility and rely on their flex in the truest sense of the word, requiring that they'll often have to become a first-in, gun-out entry in many rounds, relying on the catalyst to create a favorable position for them. You'll remember I referred to catalysts as the door openers for their entries. Well, if you have someone who can open the door wide enough, anyone can walk in, and that's the premise of this style. You don't necessarily need it to be a true entry if that player is enabled well enough. Now that we've seen what these functional roles look like when assigned to a couple different regions' compositions, let's start looking at what the permutations may look like. If we take NA standard and you want to swap out your flex, you could switch your Sovo for a Sky, for example. In this situation, you're losing a bit of flexibility, but instead you're gaining supplemental catalytic tools, something that we just saw Europe has a fairly strong preference for. For smokes, you can switch your Omen to a Brimstone. The fact that you're losing Omen's secondary capabilities as a catalyst is band-aided by the fact that you just made a Sova for Sky swap. And for your Lurk/Anchor, you could swap out a Cypher for Killjoy. While losing a little bit of Lurk potential here, arguably you're gaining a debatably stronger Anchor, as well as an ultimate that in a lot of ways can serve as an incredibly potent catalytic tool. Again, shoring up that fact that you have conceded your Omen. You can swap out your Jet, who serves the dive and op roles, for a Raze, who's capable of filling the exact same ones. And you can switch out your Phoenix, who is an entry/catalyst, for a Reyna, who also coincidentally fills those exact same roles. We've now created two compositions with literally zero agent overlap, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of functional roles are identical. The compositions can be played in much the same style and to much the same effect. As a matter of fact, and you'll have to take my word on this, I made these graphics quite a way back now. Far enough back that European VCT hadn't kicked off yet. In EU's Challengers, Wave Esports brought out functionally this bottom composition out of the blue with almost no precedent existing before it. The sole difference being, instead of Reyna, they brought Jet, leaning more towards that Southeast Asian standard composition I presented as opposed to the North American one. While it almost assuredly wasn't through use of a system as explicit as this one, it just goes to show that Wave Esports very clearly had an inherent understanding of the functional roles that standard compositions had, and they recognized the opportunity to mix up those roles and catch opponents off guard. As more agents are added to the game and more archetypes find their way into standard regional metagames, this system will always give you an option to assign functional roles to the agents therein, and mix things up, find gimmicks, discover unique combinations of agent abilities that will give you the opportunity to distinguish yourselves and get those advantages that I know we're all looking for. Alright, and that will about wrap us up for this second installment of Mastering Macro. I wanted to close it with a bit of clarification that this certainly isn't a hardline rule. There will be rounds and situations in every single game where teammates die, tempo has to change, and bottlenecking an agent into a singular functional role just flatly doesn't work. And that's the nature of the game, that's completely fine. This is a macro strategic framework that's meant to be used to understand the broad strategy that an archetype is trying to employ and give us the ability to intermix pieces and introduce more variety into the game to catch our opponents off guard. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Again, this is just the second installment in this series. There will be a third one quickly coming. We've gone from a situation now where we understand the utility kits of teams and how they're going to try to employ them, how those utility kits are used to fill certain functional roles within compositions, and now we're going to be going a step further and taking those functional roles and expanding them into full-scale styles that teams try to use, how those styles interplay with each other, and how there are natural counters between those different styles, using context from, of all things, trading card games, because I'm a massive nerd. If that sounds like something you're interested in, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Should be coming down the pipeline fairly soon here, and you'll be getting tons of regular Valorant content in the meantime. Would love to hear your guys' thoughts down below, what you think of this system. I know a lot of people come from Counter-Strike, and so phrases like Lurk are very common terms in that game, and my interpretations of them are definitely not necessarily what is used traditionally in that game. Do you think that this system has specific flaws in it? Do you think that there's a better way to frame certain functional roles in this game? Would love to hear down below. Nonetheless, really appreciate you guys tuning in as always, and I will see you in the next one.